Okay, good evening. Good evening. On behalf of Rabbanit Oshra Koren, Director of Matana Sharon, myself and the Tzevet at Matana Sharon, we welcome you all here this evening and thank you for your support of tonight's event. My name is Tammy Levy, coordinator of tonight. We are humbled by the incredible turnout tonight, both in person and on Zoom. Humbled but not surprised, as we know how important the content of tonight's presentation is, both to us and to each of you who has come out as a protest against the events of October 7th. I call on Rabbanit Oshra Koren, who will open the evening.
Good evening, everyone. First of all, I want to thank Tammy for making this happen. I want to thank our partners. I wanted to say in crime, our partners for the evening. I wanted to thank, first of all, Yael Leibowitz, our outstanding teacher and Tanakh scholar, for speaking tonight. I want to thank Paula Weiss, Queskin, did I say it right? Weiss. I want to thank her. Tammy will introduce the speakers. And I want to thank Orit Sulciano, did I say it right? Who is the chairperson, the director, executive director of the Association of Rape Centers in Israel. We're very, very moved by the partnership. I want to acknowledge Sharon Deshen, who is the mankalit of the director of Kolech, which is the women's national feminist movement in Israel, also for the partnership. And I'm really happy that we're all here together. It says in the Torah, Vayomer Adonai El Kain, Ei Hevel Achicha. Vayomer Kain, Kain responds when God asks him, where is your brother? What is Kain's response? I don't know. Lo yadati. Hashomer Achi Anochi. Am I my brother's keeper? I don't know. And God says to him, Kol dmei achicha zoakim elecha min adama. God says to him, what have you done? The blood of your brother Hevel is crying out from the ground, from the land. God knows, when God turns to Cain, God knows where Hevel is. But God wants Cain to take moral responsibility for his brother. God wants him to care about his brother, to be responsible for his brother, and Cain refuses to take moral responsibility for his brother. Now we stand here today, everyone here in Matan and Ra'anana in this Beit Midrash in Israel, and all of our friends and all of our families and all of the people, women and men on Zoom, all of us stand here and say, Shomer achi anochi, shomeret achoti anochi. I am my sister and my brother's keeper. I am responsible. We follow in the footsteps, not of Cain, not of Adam HaRishon who doesn't take responsibility. We follow in the footsteps of the women in Yetziat Mitzrayim and the Exodus, who all of them, Yocheved, Miriam, the daughter of Pharaoh, all of them stood there to protect the baby Moshe. And by protecting Moshe, they are protecting the Redeemer. They are protecting of Am Yisrael. They're protecting the future of Am Yisrael. They are standing there and they say, we cannot stand on the side. We cannot look the other way when our brother is in danger, when our brother or sister are at harm. And a new commentary that I just learned of when it says, when the daughter of Pharaoh opens the teva, when Bat Paro opens the teva, what does she say? Vatiftach vatireu et hayeled, v'hinei nar boche vatachmol alav. She opens the ark, the teva, and she sees the child, and she has compassion on the child. But what does it say strangely enough? V'hinei na'ar boche. Now, what is nar in English? A what? A youth, an adolescent. I don't know if a teenager, but he's not a baby and he's not a young child. So what does that mean? V'hinei na'ar boche. Shut says, v'tiftach v'tireu et hayeled. V'hinei yeled boche. What does it mean that she sees a nar boche? So a new commentary, very moving commentary that I just heard, is of Baal HaTurim in the 13th century, who says, who is the Na'ar Boche? And then she says, Mi Yaldei Ivrim Zeh. How does she know that that child that is crying is a Hebrew child? So of course, if he's drifting in the of course she understands that he's a Jewish child, a Hebrew child. But the commentary, Baal HaTurim says, you know who the Na'ar is that is crying? It's Aharon, who's sitting there on the side crying. And when she sees that one brother is crying because of the fate of another brother, she says, that he must be Jewish because he cares that his brother is suffering. That's what Baal HaTurim says. And she says, over a child like this, of course, I have to have compassion, surprisingly enough. And of course, Bat Para is an amazing heroine who beyond color, race, status, has compassion. Now, all of these women together show us how much strength there is when we stand together. Women and men as well. And where did Moshe learn to have compassion? From the women in his life, from his brother, from his family. They taught him how one has to pursue justice and stand up for every human being, be it a Jewish person or a Gentile person. That's who Moshe is, and that's what he has taught us in his life. And that is the message that he has given over to us. To be a Jew, to be a human being, that is the basic trait of being Jewish, is to care about our sister, to care about our brother, to stand up and say, Shomeret achi anochi, shomer achi anochi, I am responsible. And I just learned from Rabbi Zaks, it's a beautiful quote that Tanya is here, Dr. Tanya White is here, famous Dr. Tanya White. She shared with me, Rabbi Zaks says about responsibility means, he says that, about responsibility, that is response and ability. That I am responsive towards another human being and I will take action. Or as he says, achrayut is to see the acher, to see the other person. And this is our call tonight and this evening. We stand up. We want to give voice to those who do not have voice. And we do not agree to stay silent, and we do not agree to turn and not look. We have to stand here and cry out, not to be victims, to take action. And this is why we all gathered here today, to hear what is being done and what can we do looking forward. But before we start, we would like to say a prayer together for, and I'm going to go get the siddur. We'd like to say a prayer together for Chayalei Tzva Hagana Yisrael and for the Shvuyim and Ne'edarim. As we say, we care, Shomer Achi, Shomeret Achoti Anochi. So I'd like to ask everybody to rise for the prayer. And together again, I would like to thank everyone for coming here in this room and all over the globe, people that have come to stand with us and support and amplify and to give a voice. מי שבירך אבותינו, אברהם, יצחק ויעקב, הוא יברך את חיילי צבא ההגנה לישראל ואת אנשי כוחות הביטחון העומדים על משמר ארצנו וערי אלוהינו, מהלבנון עד מדבר מצרים ומן הים הגדול עד לבוא ערבה ומכל מקום שהם, ביבשה, באוויר ובים. ייתן אדוני את אויבינו הקמים עלינו ניגפים לפניהם. הקדוש ברוך הוא ישמור ויציל את חיילינו מכל צרה וצוקה ומכל נגע ומחלה, וישלח ברכה והצלחה בכל מעשה ידיהם. ידבר שונאינו תחתיהם ויעטרם בכתר ישועה ובעטרן וניצחון, ויקוים בהם הכתוב כי אדוני אלוהיכם ההולך עמכם להילחם לכם עם אויביכם להושיע אתכם, ונאמר אמן. ועכשיו אני אגיד לשבויים ולנעדרים: מי שברך אבותינו אברהם יצחק ויעקב יוסף משה ואהרון ודוד ושלמה שרה רבקה רחל ולאה, הוא יברך וישמור וינצור את נעדרי צבא ההגנה לישראל ואת השבויים בתוך שאר אחינו בית ישראל הנתונים בצרה ובשביה, בעבור שהקהל כולנו מתפללים בעבורם. הקדוש ברוך הוא ימלא רחמים עליהם ויוציאם מחושך וצלמוות ומוסרותיהם ינתק ומצוקותיהם יושיעם וישיבם מהרה לחיק משפחותיהם. יודו לאדוני חסדו ונפלאותיו לבני אדם, ויקוים בהם מקרא שכתוב: ופדויי אדוני ישובון ובאו ציון ברינה, ושמחת עולם על ראשם, ששון ושמחה ישיגו, ונסו יגון ואנחה, ונאמר אמן.
In 2017, the hashtag #MeToo movement sparked a societal reckoning as millions of women's voices about the sexual violence they'd experienced were allowed to be heard, no longer forced into silence, putting a spotlight on sexual abuse and gender-based violence. The phrase #MeToo, coined in 2006 by activist Tarana Burke, went viral in 2017 as actress Alyssa Milano tweeted #MeToo and encouraged others who had been sexually harassed or assaulted to do the same. Milano got 12 million responses on social media within 24 hours, a watershed moment for every woman everywhere. The issue finally gained the platform it deserved. Fast forward to 2023. On October the 7th, Hamas's weapon of choice was not just the massacre of Jewish towns, not just the murder, decapitation, and desecration of Jewish men, women, children, and babies. It was several steps further than that. Hamas preyed on the deepest vulnerabilities of any woman, brutalizing Jewish women, weaponizing sexual violence. The world's response, rather than outrage, was to weaponize silence. Where was the sisterhood of the #MeToo movement that had grown so mighty since 2017? Conspicuously silent. Where was the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres and the agency UN Women? Conspicuously silent. The UN Agency for Gender Equality and Women's Empowerment released its first statement about the Hamas atrocities on November 25th, 50 days after the onslaught took place. A week later, on December 1st, the agency condemned the Hamas attacks for the first time, saying it was alarmed by accounts of systematic sexual violence and supported an investigation into the matter. It took 50 days to say anything at all, and an additional seven days to condemn the atrocities perpetrated by Hamas. An epic embarrassment of double standards. And hence the phrase #MeToo unless you're a Jew. We were inspired by this grassroots movement, and we encourage you all to sign their petition. Paula will relate to this a little later. Let us be clear. Abuse of any woman in any society is unacceptable. In his book, The Great Partnership, Rabbi Jonathan Sacks speaks about man's call to redemptive deed, to action in the face of evil. He says, perhaps this is not the world we would have chosen, but it is the one we have. Either we resign ourselves to the evil it contains, or we register a protest against it. It begins with a cry that is only stilled when we hear the judge of all the earth calling us to help bring justice into the human world we make together. In the poem Eshet Chayil that is traditionally read on a Friday night before we say Kiddush, we read the words, Oz v'hadar levusha v'tischak liyom acharon. Strength and majesty are her garments, and she looks positively to the future. The barbaric acts of October 7th sought to disrobe us, the Jewish women, of our garments of strength and majesty, and indeed they did. But we are here tonight affirming never again. I welcome our esteemed panel, Yael Leibowitz, Paula Kreskin-Weiss, and Orit Siriziano. It is evenings like this and efforts like yours that seek together and restore the shredded fabrics of our strength, courage, beauty, and majesty. and as we come together to stand up for what is right and good in the world and answer this call to action. Our deepest appreciation to each of you, Orit, Paula, and Yael, for making yourselves available to address this important topic. And beyond that, for the work you are doing in your individual spheres, Yael, a Torah educator, framing and sharing an often misunderstood perspective in Tanakh, and tonight particularly those that relate to women. Paula, hearing, bringing justice and giving a voice to the most marginalized of women. And Orit, bringing shelter and safety and indeed future to victims of sexual abuse. Orit Siliziano is the executive director of the Association of Rape Crisis Centers in Israel. Prior to this, she has served as the spokesperson for the Israel's Women Network, IWN, Israel's leading women's advocacy group. Orit is a sought-after media interviewee and commentator on sexual harassment-related issues. Orit, we welcome you to address us.
Evening, everybody. And first of all, I must say I'm overwhelmed to see so many people out of the house at this time of evening. It was kol hakavod. Yeah. Well, first of all, I will just present in a few words who I am, who we are. So I had the Association of Rape Crisis Centers over a decade. And as everything happens, it's women who do something. And in 1978, there was a woman in Tel Aviv, a student who was sexually abused. She went to the police to file a complaint. She got bad reaction from the police. Nothing is surprising. And what she did, she committed suicide. And she wrote a letter back then that she did that because she felt that she was raped, second raped by the police. After that happened, a few women said, let's do something. And they established the first rape crisis center in Israel in Tel Aviv in 1978. Since then, 9 other rape crisis centers were established, also a wonderful one in Ra'anana, by women. Each one is a different NGO in the specific municipality. And 33 years ago, all of these centers together, they said, we need someone to represent us in the Knesset, to initiate laws, policies, and this is how we were born. And this is the Association of Rape Crisis Centers. We're an advocacy organization that change laws, change lives, raises awareness, and fight for having a society clean sexual violence. This is a big vision, but slowly, slowly, we're trying to change the world. Now on the 7th of October, we all woke up to this horrific situation. And after 1, 2, 3 days, we at the centers already got information about what has happened. It was unbelievable because never in Israel's history, there was such a thing, systematic sexual abuse by terrorists. I want even to open a parenthesis and tell you something that we opposed in the Knesset, and I'm still proud of that, but it has to do with this issue. We opposed a law that was passed in the Israeli Knesset, a law that said that if there's going to be a sexual violence, which is a al reka laumani, nationalistic sexual violence, then the penalty would be double as much. This law was made passed half a year ago but it was initiated by the Lieberman, Israel Beiteno, and Limor Son Har-Melech from the Tzionut Hadatit, I think she is. And we opposed this law because then we said, actually, according to the Israeli Chok Lepa'ulot Eiva, I don't know how to translate that in English, there is a penalty, double the penalty if a crime is done because of terroristic reasons. We disagree that there will be a special law that actually meant if an Arab rapes a Jewish woman, the penalty will be doubled, because then we said there will be hierarchy of felonies. If a father abuses his daughter, is it that less worse than if a terrorist abuses a woman? We still think it's both horrific. The law has passed, but anyway, when we get to what happened now, you will understand that the law will not help us. So a few days after the 7th of October, we got the information that sexual abuse has happened, and one of our things is to be very, very accurate. We deal with human lives. if we say something which is not, everybody looks at us and wants to hear us. But we decided to approach the Red Cross. I must say we were innocent because we thought that if we approach the Red Cross to press them to do the best they can to release the hostages, and we came with them with a list of cases we knew about sexual violence of survivors. Yeah. Unfortunately, we all know history already has passed, and we know that the Red Cross has limited power. And even if we brought them this kind of information, they could not have done nothing, and we all see the results. But back then, it was, I think, the 10th of the 11th of October, we were very, very scared to write this letter. And if you Google the first mention in the Israeli media about sexual violence in the 7th of October slaughter is this letter. Why were we afraid? Because we thought about the families, the parents of the hostages, and we said, oh boy, we will write this letter, and then, they will know. But on the other hand, we thought that we must do something because these women over there must be suffering a lot. And every day, just yesterday, if you heard the news, one of the returned hostages said, I don't know if you heard about, she said that the women she met there were suffering from sexual violence, so they're still there. We indeed wrote that letter, and the reality did not change. But then slowly, actually it was not slowly, it was a tsunami. And we, the organization, has felt that very directly of phone calls from media all over the world, from parliament members, all of them wanted the information. And also the Israeli government, they all called us, give us the stories, give us the testimonies. And one of the things I felt very bad, many years I'm an activist in women's issues, and what I felt, and I know the media very well, and I know how everybody wants, in Hebrew you say yellow, I don't know if you say the same,
yellow bread.
Okay, I understand that, but it was unbelievable. So it was so intense and so obsessed. Give us a story. Do you have a story to tell us about a woman who suffered from a gang rape in the Nova Festival? You can't believe how many telephone calls from all over the world and all the media. And because I understood that on one hand you have to give the media something, and in the first time ever, our organization sort of felt like some part of the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs, because this issue is a lot bigger than what we do in the regular life. But you have to be accurate. You have to tell only the things that you know, but there's a story to tell and the world wants to hear. And I want to tell you about the information. Of course, I'm not going to get to any graphic information, but how do we know, and how come it's so problematic? And it exactly reflects our work in rape crisis centers, because usually when a woman or a man are sexually abused, only maybe 6-7% of the people that are abused go to file a complaint in the police. Out of that, only 1 or 2% pass the court, get to the court. 75% of the cases who get to the court, they win. But 80% of the files close, no evidence. What happened now? Is there evidence? What is evidence? What do we have and what we don't have? First of all, we know there are a few women who survived this massacre, that were abused and are alive. How many? We don't know, and we will never know. That, as you said, Tammy, about the Me Too, this is not Me Too. Nobody will say, hey, hello, my name is XYZ, and I was raped by a Hamas terrorist. Not now. First of all, there is a big shame. Of course, nobody should be ashamed, but we live in the Israeli society, and there is shame, embarrassment that this kind of thing happened to me. Secondly, the women who passed that are in such a horrific trauma, they now have to get therapy, get maybe pills, and it will take them a lot of time, maybe years, to pass that. And now I want to tell you something. Me, myself, being second generation of a Holocaust survivor, my mother, who was in Auschwitz and passed the Holocaust when she was a Na'ara, adolescent, she never said 0 things about what happened to her. Some survivors said, and others did not say. But if all of you who live in Israel can remember that only in the last decade we heard stories or some movies about sexual abuse in the Second World War. Why did it take 60 years, 65 years to tell that? Because even the horrific things that took place in the Second World War, you can talk about the gas chambers, you can talk about many things, you can talk about sexual violence by the Nazis. It's unbelievable, it's horrific, and you cannot talk about it. So this kind of expectation that there is in Israel by the media and by the authorities, we want the stories, is not suited at all to the trauma. And it's also something that I feel is not correct because, and I will tell you an example, the Israeli government, the Israeli police wants the stories. Why? Maybe to sue in the Hague court, to have proof, to have evidence. And one of the things, maybe if you saw Haaretz newspaper, because we wrote a letter to the Minister of the Health and the Chief of Staff of the Police. The Chief of Staff of the Police and the Ministry of Health wrote a letter to all the hospitals in Israel, asking them, commanding them that if they have information, indications about sexual violence of the hostages who have returned or survivors from the party, please tell the police without the names, okay? Imagine you are a patient, go to the hospital, okay? Now imagine there are 10 hostages now that returned in one of the PEMOT, returned to the hospital. And out of the 10, there may be 8 old women, 1 child, and 1 woman in the ages of 20 to, I don't know when. So if someone in the hospital says, we have 1 indication, and they don't say the name, is it hard to guess? The secretary who writes the letter to the police says, yes, we indeed have 1 indication. She types the letter in the hospital. Is it hard to guess? Israel is a small country. Everybody talks. Everybody wants to know. And the gossip will immediately pinpoint to the survivor. We thought it's outrageous that the Ministry of Health permits the police to get information about patients. This is my story. This is my private story. Who can know about me? Even if my name is not there, everybody will know. We wrote a letter, and now we're writing letters to all of the managers of the hospitals in Israel, because we think that this is it's to פגיעה בפרטיות, how do you say that?
Invading their privacy.
Invading your privacy. And nobody every patient who has whatever disease or whatever problem doesn't want nobody to give our part. So this is something which is very symbolic, because once the women were subject to abuse, their subjective, they became an object of the Hamas, who wanted to destroy Israel, wanted to contaminate the woman. And the woman is not a person, she's an object. Second, the Israeli government, because the Israeli government, wants the information, and we can totally understand this information is important, but you cannot get this information on the back of the woman. So as I said, where do we have information? Because most of the women and men also are not alive who were abused. But it's like a puzzle. We all heard, all of us, I assume, heard testimonies of the Zaka people, of the paramedics, of soldiers. Me and Sharon were in some kind of panel, and we heard a son of a soldier who went to one of the kibbutzim and saw things people see. And we also heard testimonies of the people who dealt with the corpses that are shouting, Now, I do not know if you know, but what did not happen, the Israeli police could not take rape kits. They did not think about it as a crime area. They thought about it as a terrorist area. So because of this reason, and I cannot complain about it, because I can understand that it was so unbelievable, so horrific, the numbers were so big. So nobody thought about it. And as you know, in the Jewish religion, the most important thing is to put the body into burial, tell the parents, and so nobody waited. So all of the testimonies are the real legal testimonies are not existent. We don't have, how can we know if someone was raped or no? This is the problem of the soul woman who is abused. How can she prove? Now Israel was raped, okay? Now Israel has problems to prove, and if you read the newspapers, it says from time to time that the Israeli police has problems of collecting data, collecting evidence, because as I said, there are not, up till now, there is not one survivor who came to speak up. And I hope that nobody will speak now, because first you have to deal with your mind, and to suffer from such a thing, it takes time till you heal and you can speak, okay? But we heard that there are two testimonies. One of them was in the newspaper, a horrible testimony. I don't want to repeat it. No, all of us are influenced by what we heard. But it's secondhand testimony. It's not the first voice. So, but there is a big puzzle. And one of the things I had to deal with a lot of all of these news, like all the big newspapers in the world, and I do not know if you read the big New York Times article, which I have helped them a lot with this article, because I knew it will be a game changer. Like, it's the most important newspaper in the world, and it took them 2 months to do the article. They interviewed 150 people, and I gave them a lot of information, so they will have who to approach, how to collect this data. They also do not have any testimony firsthand, and they will not have it. They could not have it now. So this thing prove. How do you know that she was raped? How do you know? You know, and this, all the foreign media. This is what we felt all the time, this is one of the reasons it took so long. And if there was no New York Times, I do not know where we were today, by the way. And also for them, they have there is in Spotify an interviewer in Haaretz. They interviewed Anat Schwartz, who was one of the women who helped them do this investigation, and she tells them how did they do it, what were the problems. It's not easy to write this kind of story, and it has to be accurate, because everybody in the world is waiting for us to do some mistake, and we all know where we're going on. So and one more thing I want to tell you about when we were talking about the silence of the UN woman. First of all, when I Googled who has UN woman, Dr. Sima Bar-Chos has UN woman. She's a very credible woman. She's from Jordan, from Jordanian origin. And this is one explanation, you know, politics comes before gender. And as an organization who fights sexual violence, we also see that many times politics comes before fighting reality and changing the reality. And also, there's if any one of you saw television last week, there was a program in Chasifa, Chaim Etgar. They portrayed Lenora Bargil, the former Miss Universe, who came to the United Nations and talked and told about her story. And as Israel's chutzpah, she ran after. She talked quite aggressively, but it was I liked the way she did it with Pramila Preton, which is the High Representative of the UN to deal with sexual violence in conflict. And in the end, this Pramila Preton, she did release a statement condemning and acknowledging. But the issue of the proof of the evidence is still an issue. I don't know if there will be ever a court case. I do not know if Israel will have evidence, because as I told you, the survivors are very few, most of them are murdered. The bodies, we saw the bodies, even if you see bodies without clothes, how can you say that someone was raped? You can imagine that no woman goes to a party without underpants, but from this to prove in a legal court that she was raped with no rape kit, that's a big question. So I think actually what I see now is really a reflection of our day-to-day work, because we deal with sexual violence, we fight sexual violence. We said it happened, we believe you. Me Too is the worldwide acknowledgement that we should break the code of silence. But now the private problem of women and men who are abused becomes a national problem of a country who was abused. And the country now has a lot of challenge to prove it. What do we do as a society, and what do we do as an organization, and what do we do as society? First of all, one of the things that we try to influence our government to understand that, we talk about now about the trauma of the Israeli people. All of us are in trauma, bigger or smaller. The soldiers who will come back, our children, the Zaka people, the doctors, the therapists, all of them who meet this trauma are also re-traumatized, and we're still in war. We don't even have now the quiet to deal with the whole problem. It will take years. We as an organization are thinking a lot about how to make Israel a trauma-informed society, that all the medical care, even when Shabak, think about it, the Shabak receives the hostages back. Hopefully, we pray that all of them will come back. They interrogate the hostages, right? Do they ask them questions? Do they ask them questions if something happened to you? Are they allowed to do that? If a woman comes back from being in captivity and somebody from the Shabak asks her what has happened to her, is that correct to do that? Is he the right person to do that, or she the right person? Or first she has to come back and slowly return. There's so many traumas over that. So one of the things, if you remember the first photograph of Gal Hirsch holding the two hostages in his hands, remember that photograph, two American women that were first released? As an organization, when we saw this photograph, we were very angry. How come he dared to touch them? How come? These women returned from captivity. We don't know what happened to them. Don't touch them. Don't hug them like that. Anyway, it's not him that rescued them, but touching is very delicate when you're doing. You have to be very, very, very careful. So this was just one example, and there was a lot of uproar on this photograph, and we did give recommendations to the Israeli government how to deal with the hostages who come back, asking, not asking, who should do that, and we see that there's a lot of understanding today. The thing is the long term, because it will take many years to deal with all of what happened. And people, for example, from the kibbutzim, if there are women there who were abused, but maybe they lost a member from their family, maybe they lost a child, they lost their house, now they're in a hotel, they have to deal with so many things. They have to put this issue aside because it's multi-layered trauma. It will take time, and we really hope, because we all know our country, now everybody wants to help, everybody wants to donate. They say that anyone who wants therapy will get that immediately, but if you are just a regular survivor of sexual violence, you can wait 2 years till you get public therapy. But if you are a survivor from the war, immediately. First of all, everybody has to get it immediately. But it's very sad, what we deal now with all the women we help, and they feel nobody cares about them. Their pain is not acknowledged. So this is another issue. So Israel, it's a long-term change that we have to deal with and help the people. I'm thinking also about the witnesses that saw, that heard. 24-year Raz something Cohen, I think that he was on TV. He's 24-year-old guy, so young. He heard what he heard. How will that influence him? Yeah. So this is one perspective. All the policies in Israel, especially mental health, if there are therapists here or social workers, everybody knows that Israel is suffering a lot from mental health treatment. There's a lot of problems in the public system, not enough funding, not enough treatment, and the country will have to pay for that. And should do it trauma-informed. The second thing is all the legal process. We never, as rape crisis centers, we never tell someone go to file a complaint, because we know it's very hard. We explain what does it mean, what does it take. You have to have this inner power to do that. It's not easy. So imagine there will be a survivor that will want to, will think about it. Would that be good for her to talk in the Hague? Would that help her? I don't know. what is justice? Would that bring her justice? It's a big question because you have to have a very strong personality to deal with that. And what I'm saying now, it's also what we learned from other countries like Yugoslavia and like Ukraine, that they also dealt with sexual violence as war crimes. Justice for the nation is not like justice for the individual. It's different. And justice is a big word, and it's not only the law. Law doesn't bring, everyone who, Paula, you're a lawyer. I know that everyone who studies law knows that the first lesson you study in law school, justice is not what you get always from legal cases. So this is a big question, how the survivors will get justice, and if Israel will get justice, I do not know. But, the thing is that we should, I always say, I say now, first of all, we should stop this obsession, we as the government, we the media, to look after the survivors and hear the stories. If they come, they will come, but it will take a very, very long time. Second, this thing is one of the worst things that could happen to a human being, but on the other hand, we all have resilience, and societies overcome horrible things. And we had a webinar with this professor of victimology from Serbia, and she said, you don't know, but one day this will be your past. And I always think about the sentence, one day, I hope it won't be soon. I hope it will be soon. This will be our past, but we will have to help all the people. We as organizations will help them. And I'm really happy also to say that we get a lot of support also from Jews around the world. I never felt in such strong feeling of achdut from the Jewish people. And this is something good that is a result, as consequences from this horrific war. I hope it will stay. And also achdut in our people. And we have to be patient and also optimistic, because otherwise, what can we do? So this is what we're dealing with right now. And we have to remember the people who were victimized before, and the people who will take them a long time till they tell the story. And just if some of you read the article of the New York Times, in the article, and this will be my final words, I hope they didn't do it in a horrible way, but they talked about the woman in the black dress. Did some of you hear about? I saw this photograph of the woman in the black dress. You see a dead young woman in a black dress and without her underpants. And you can imagine what had happened to her. Now the family did not know that. I think she learned it, the family, from the New York Times. Yeah. And I'm thinking about this family a lot. This woman is married. She and her husband are dead. They have 2 children, and I'm thinking a lot about them. Because on one hand, if you saw the New York Times, they also, and if not, I can send you the link. They were photographed in the newspaper, so they agreed to be part of the article. But there are consequences to that. I think they live in Kiryat Ekron. It's a small community. People start to talk. And, people, like the community knows and talks, and the children, they have 2 children. One is 10 years old and one younger. These children will grow up and everybody knows about their mother. Is it good for them? I'm not sure. Yeah. So this is what has happened. And maybe one last word that we're trying also to do right now. We got together with Matei HaChatufim, the hostages headquarters, and Professor Dana Pograch to do a united project to create special rights for the victims of the 7th of October massacre. I'll give you one example, which has to do with our work. In Israel, there is no law that prohibits torture to adults. There is no such a law. Why? Because we never had to do that. But some of the hostages, for example, and maybe some of the survivors were tortured. Even, they went to Gaza and were hit all the way like that, or all kinds of, I don't want to get to other details, and we don't know everything, but we heard. This kind of law does not exist. This kind of felony did not exist. So we're trying to initiate new laws, and then new rights. And this is one of the big things that we're doing now, because we're looking at that in our perspective of sexual violence, but there are other perspectives. And we're trying, and these people, so many families of people who are not alive anymore, people who are alive, and there is hostages that have come back, they will need a lot of help from our country. And you know, I believe in civil society, and I work in civil society. The civil society will do the work, and we will do the work. All the people who care, the country, the government, I hope they will do the work. And if not, we will push them to help. But this is one of the consequences of what has happened, and that we have to change our society for the good, to help. I think it's thousands of people that are influenced, but by the 7th of October, that's hard. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Orit. We really commend you on your incredible work, and particularly on the sensitivity with which you're approaching everything that you're doing. Thank you. Yael Leibowitz is a master Tanakh teacher and soon-to-be published authoress. She received her master's degree in Judaic Studies from Columbia University and has taught Tanakh in many prestigious settings in the United States and Israel. Yael has a novel voice to share on so many important topics in Tanakh. Yael, it is our honor to host you tonight.
First of all, thank you so much to everyone who came out, to everyone who's on Zoom, can you hear me? Just from the few Zoom meetings we had together, I am truly, truly inspired by Orit, by Paula, by Tammy and Oshra's dedication to this program. I don't think there's a more important topic really to be discussed today. So Orit is discussing building a civil society, and you're talking about how it sort of falls on the people, right? We can't necessarily trust our leaders. And what I wanted to share with you today is two very, very quick stories. I know one thing, if there's one place I shine, it's sticking to time. So I will, right here. So in the interest of time, I'm going to summarize what's happening in these two stories. Both of them take place in the period of Shoftim, which we're going to see momentarily why that's relevant. But they're stories that I think perhaps actually many of us might have imagined couldn't occur today. And unfortunately, we've learned they can. But what I want to talk about is what do we do when we see stories like this and when we come across stories like this in Tanakh, not perpetrated by our enemy, but perpetrated by our own. So I'm going to summarize two very, very quick stories. The first one is about the daughter of Yiftach. Yiftach, as many of you might know, was one of the actually relatively better Shoftim in the sense that he fought against the enemies successfully. He had fear of God. He went out under the banner of God. He was fighting for the people. But Yiftach, as we know, made one critical mistake. He was in the middle of battle, and as was par for the course in the ancient world, and we see this throughout Tanakh and the ancient Near East, people would make a vow to God. They would sort of have this little deal. They would say, if you allow, right, or if you enable A, I will make sure to do B, right? So Yiftach, in the middle of battle, the tide is turning against him, and he gets very nervous. And so he says to God, God, I promise you that if you allow me to defeat my enemies in this war, the first thing that runs out of my house, I will dedicate to you. Okay, now, of course, we understand how in the late Bronze Age houses were built, right? You don't have the animals out on the farm and then the house. You have the house and the animals surrounding the house. And so in all likelihood, we have to assume Yiftach imagined that the first animal that was going to run out when he came home, he would sacrifice on the altar. But of course, we know the tragedy that ensues is that his daughter, his only daughter, it says, Rak hi yechida, right there, the language is borrowed from the Akedat Yitzchak, ironically. She runs out to greet him. And she runs out, it says, with the timbrel, the stories that we're familiar with from Shirat Miriam and from these stories when Shaul is coming back from war, right? The women would run out and they would give the heroes their welcome, which is part of the incentive for men to actually be valiant on the battlefield, was the hero's welcome that they would receive. And his only daughter runs out to greet him. And she's the first thing to leave that fence and to greet him. And he looks down and he says, oh my God, what have you done? Okay, now, again, the language to describe her in that story is borrowed from Akedat Yitzchak. So we, as students of Tanakh, expect God, right, to do what he did, which is to step in and to scream out and say, don't touch a hair on her head. I don't demand child sacrifice, right? But that's not what happened. I'm going to read to you. I'm trying to think in the interest of time to just do it quickly in English. I'm just going to read in English very quickly in the interest of time. Okay, she turns to her father and she says, whatever you did, just do. Okay, and whatever you promised, you have to follow through on your promise. And she says, just give me 2 months to mourn my impending death and the loss of any future I might have had. Give me 2 months to go cry in the hills with my friends. And he gives her those 2 months, and then it says, "Vayihi miket shnayim chadashim vatashav el aviha." She goes back to her father. Vayas la et midro asher nadar. And credit to the authors of this sefer that they couldn't even write that he sacrificed her as an olah, which means that he would have burned her entire body and dedicated it to God. But that's in fact what he did. That's the first story. Okay. We have another story towards the end of Sefer Shoftim, which is, I think, very likely perhaps the bloodiest and the most horrific of stories when we're speaking specifically about violence against women. We have the story of what's known as Pilegesh Begiva. She's not even named, which we're going to understand in a couple of minutes why that's relevant. And this woman, this Pilegesh Begiva, we're told she's living with her husband and then she goes back to her father's home. So automatically red flags go off, right? Because we're talking about the ancient Near East. We're dealing with a patrilocal system where women move from their father's home and they move into their husband's home, and that's where they stay with his extended family. So the fact that she's running back to her father's home already, right, raises questions. What's happening in the home of her husband? We're never given an answer. What we do find out is that a few months later, the husband goes and follows her to her father's home. And there's this sort of ensuing, the father keeps trying to keep the husband under his roof, and the husband keeps trying to go. And there's this cute little, or it's not actually cute at all, but there's this sort of charming little back and forth where the father says, you know what, it's dark out already. Stay one more night. Just say, what's it going to kill you? Stay one more night. And so if we weren't already on guard, what's happening to this daughter, we're even more concerned that her father doesn't want to send her back, right? A father should want his daughter in those days to go back to the husband's house. Eventually they go back. And it talks about how the husband essentially puts her on the back of an animal, and they leave and they're moving through with a na'ar. It's the husband, the na'ar, and his wife. And they're traveling on a donkey to go back home, but it gets dark out. And they can't just sleep outdoors because they might be vulnerable. And ironically, the na'ar that's with him says, let's go sleep with these people. And the man says, oh, they're not ours. We can't sleep with not, right? We can't stay in a city that's not Israelite. We don't know what they might do, okay, which is one of the most ironic verses in all of Tanakh. And instead they get to the city, this place called the Giva. And they get there, and the city that is so evocative of the story of stone hears that an old man in the city of Giva welcomed in a stranger. Now, hospitality and the hospitality codes in the ancient world is one of the most, I would say, important ways or most important symbols that define or describe whether a place has a moral code, right? If you're able to welcome strangers in, if you're able to share of your own, if you feel safe enough to open your doors and open the gates of your city to allow others in, that says a tremendous amount about your city. We have in the city this area of the Giv'ah. We have an old man who invites in this husband, the Pilegesh, and the Na'ar. But then as they're eating dinner, the people of the city start banging on the door, and they start screaming, and they say, send out your guests. We are going to sodomize them. Okay, now, again, as Orit and I'm sure Paula will understand, right? We understand that sexual violence is most often synonymous with war, right? It's not surprising. And they felt that the honor of their city had been infringed upon. And so they send him and they scream to this man, send out your guest. We are going to sodomize him and show him, essentially, who's in control. Okay, it's about control. The man who 5 minutes earlier we actually liked, because he was a sweet man who invited the guests in from the street, says, no, please, don't do this nivala, right? Don't do this abominable act. Take my virgin daughters, okay? The angry mob at the door is banging and banging, and the husband, in that moment, to save himself, shoves his wife out the door, locks the door behind her. And I'll just read you the very, very end of this story, because again, if I didn't read it, you might not actually believe that you may think I'm paraphrasing. Okay, this appears in Perek Yud Tet. It says, "Vayachazek ha'ish b'filagsho vayotzei aleihem hachutz." He throws her out. And there's a mob waiting out there. It says, "Vayet'u ota vayet'alelu ba kol halayla." The gang raped her for an entire night. Ad haboker, v'shalchua ba'alot hashachar. And when the sun was rising, they sent her home. Vatavo ha'isha lifnot haboker vatipol petach beit ha'ish asher adoneha sham ad ha'or. She gets there and she collapses. Now we don't know if she's even dead or alive, but she collapses by the front door. Vayakam adoneha baboker. Nothing should infuriate us more than the words, her husband woke up the next morning. Okay? Vatiftach daltot habayit, vayitze lechet lidarko. He opens up the front door and he's about to finish his journey to go home. Vihine ha'isha pilagsho nofelet petach habayit. When he trips over, he sees the body of his wife lying there on the ground. V'yadeha al hasaf, her hand was still grabbing onto the door to let herself in. Yomer eleha kumi v'nelecha. He says, get up. And it says at this point, ve'eno neh. She doesn't respond. And it's only now when we as sensitive readers realize, when she doesn't realize here, that we actually have not heard her voice for the entire story. He throws her onto the back of the animal. He rides back to his home. And I apologize ahead, but this is Tanakh. Everyone should be reading it. Chavtet, pasuk chavtet, it says, vayavo el beito, vayikach et ha'ma'achelet. He takes the knife that is reserved for cutting up the bodies of animals before a korban. Vayachazek befilagsho vayinatcheha le'atzameha l'shneim asar netachim. He cuts her body up into 12 pieces and sends it symbolically to all 12 tribes. Okay, now, what his motive was for sending it, we are not going to even try to dissect in the few minutes we have remaining. But what his sending of the pieces of her body leads to is a civil war, more stealing of women, another killing of another city, and then the kidnapping of other women. And it is at that point that Sefer Shoftim ends and says, "Vayamim hahem in melech b'Yisrael, ish hayashar be'einav yaseh." In those days, there was no king, meaning there was no centralized leadership. There was no uniform law. It was all moral relativism. Everyone did whatever they wanted. And that's the closing pasuk in Sefer Shoftim. Okay, so I'm looking around the room and I'm seeing people's faces, right? I think the question is not, I'll go back to, let's say, Orit's conversation, and I think Paula's gonna probably, right, shock, or I don't want to say shock us even more, but talk about things that to even try to wrap our heads around is painful enough. But when we hear about our brutal terrorist enemies doing things like this, it's horrible, but we compartmentalize, right? They're horrible beasts. They do beastly things. But here we are reading a story in Tanakh. Right, here we are talking about people from Israel who did something like this. And there's no angel stepping in and saying, don't you dare behave like that. And there's no voice of God saying, don't you hurt people. And so as students of Tanakh, we're left trying to understand, if this is my moral compass, what do I do with stories like this? Okay, so again, I'm just going to be approaching this one isolated episode in Sefer Shoftim. What I'm hoping really, this is not a plug for Matan, although of course it is, right, is that to study Tanakh carefully and to really understand what Tanakh is all about, we cannot take episodes out of context. It's very tempting to do that. It's very tempting to read a story like this and come to a conclusion about Tanakh and about the approach of Tanakh and about how, therefore, we must assume that Tanakh is misogynistic, or how else could it report a story like that, right? But if I were to open up a book, I'm just going to give a random example. I'm going to open up a book that was written in the 1800s about episodes in earlier periods in American history where, that takes place, let's say in the South, where slavery still existed. Okay, and I open up to a random page, and it's a gory description of a slave master beating his slave. Okay, it would be intellectually dishonest of me to open up to page 384, read that description, close the book, and say, see, the author of this book must be a racist. Why would that be intellectually dishonest? Because it could very well be that the author is actually trying to describe the horrors of slavery. It could be that he's a racist, right? But it could also be that the author of the book is trying to convince us of how horrible slavery was and how human beings need to be respected regardless of race. There's a million different things that the author could have been intending to convey through his larger work. What's irresponsible of us would be to open up to one isolated incident, close the book, and come to conclusions, okay? Now, when we talk about Sefer Shoftim, one of the things that's most interesting about Sefer Shoftim is that Sefer Shoftim is a sefer that's actually one of the few Sfarim in Tanakh that's not actually written in strictly chronological order. It doesn't necessarily it covers a period of 150 years, but it doesn't necessarily follow strict chronological order. What Sefer Shoftim is doing is it's taking all of the events that occurred over this 150-year period between the year approximately 1200 and 1050 BCE in our history, after the period of Yehoshua, before we appoint our first king. And what it's trying to do is show how, if you don't have centralized leadership, if you don't have laws that apply equally to everyone, society will deteriorate. When there is a vacuum of leadership and people are left to their own devices, horrible things happen. Now, the author doesn't necessarily trust us automatically to come to that conclusion on our own. So the author does something really interesting, right? Some of you remember Schindler's List. One of the things that's really fascinating that Steven Spielberg did is he had, the whole movie was black and white, right? But there was one thing in color. What was it? The red jacket, right? What was the red jacket? The red jacket was brilliant because when things get bad gradually, it's sometimes almost hard for us to recognize how bad things are getting when we're in that low moment, right? We sometimes forget where we started. So what Steven Spielberg did is he took this girl in the red jacket and he showed her when she was happy and in a loving family and had money and had food. And then he shows her again later on in the ghetto. And then he shows her again later on being loaded into the cattle cars. And then of course at the end, we see her jacket lying in a pile of clothes and we have to assume that she was dead. But that red jacket is such a powerful motif that's carried through the entire movie because it forces us each time we see it to go back and ask where we came from and appreciate the depths that we've sunk to. Okay? The author of Sefer Shoftim does the exact same thing. He does that by using lefties in the beginning of the Sefer when things are great and when things are amazing, and then again in the middle, and then again at the end. And every time we see lefty, we think, whoa, hold on a second. The lefty at the beginning of the Sefer, he was a hero. How did we get to a place where lefties are fighting in a civil war against each other? You have Israelites crying in the beginning and crying at the end. And again, each time we have these repeated motifs, they force us to go back to earlier phases in the history and realize how slowly things are deteriorating, okay? One of the most important motifs that the author of Sefer Shoftim uses, or I would say the most powerful symbol that the author of Sefer Shoftim uses to show us how, or to mark how we as readers and how we as people who are trying to cultivate a healthy society know if society is healthy or sick, is how women are treated and the place of women in that society. So if you go to the very beginning of Shoftim, you have Achsa, the daughter of Othniel, the first Shofet, and she doesn't like the piece of land her father gave her, so she rides safely on an animal back to her father's home, and she says, you know what, thanks so much for that parcel of land, but I need a little more water. And he says, okay, and there's no shock and there's no confusion that a woman is demanding what she thinks she deserves, and her father obliges without even blinking an eye, and no fanfare is made about the fact that a woman travels independently outside alone and comes home safely. Okay? And if we move a little bit further on, we have the story of Dvorah, for example. Dvorah, who was both a prophetess and a judge and a warrior, and went out and led them to victory. And again, no reaction, because in those early phases of Sefer Shoftim,
She reminds us of Rachel from
we're getting there. Oshra, please. Spoiler. Correct. Our modern day Rachel from Ofakim, right? Who not just lured the enemy, but fed into what we actually, the way I understand it, and I don't know if Rachel did this intentionally, she fed into the sort of stereotypes that a maternal, right? Sisera comes into the tent of Yael and he says, give me water. And she says, no, take milk and let me cover you. And she fed into all of his sort of these associations of maternal instinct. And she lulled him into this false sense of security that what can a woman actually do to a man, right? And she fed into those mistaken assumptions. And of course, as we know, as Osher mentioned, right, she not only ends up killing him, but she then goes out and makes sure that everyone out there is protected, that Barak knows that the dead Sisera is inside. Okay, those are in the early phases of history. But then as society begins to deteriorate, what the author of Shoftim does so powerfully is we watch these heroines, these independent women becoming quieter and becoming more deferential. And when we watch Bat Yiftach and the way she speaks so obsequiously to her father, well, if you have to kill me, I guess you have to kill me. We go back to Achsa and we say, how did we get here? How did we get to a point where a girl thinks that her father killing her is ever okay? Where she's deferring to male authority just because he's the male and she's the female? How did we get here? And if we move further on, and again, I'm skipping over a lot because I promised I would hold to the time. But that's exactly what Sefer Shoftim does, is over and over we watch society deteriorating. When we get to that final scene of stone in the land of Israel, where men not only tolerate gang rape, but then allow that to become a mechanism. You use the word weapon. I remember who used, I think Tammy, right? The perfect phrase to weaponize sexual violence. When we get to a place like that, the Sefer ends. And it says, essentially, the author says, if you don't fix this, if you don't get to the heart of what is eroding your society, you are going to implode and there's no future for you. Okay. Now, I gave one example of one Sefer Shoftim. Okay. If you go, for example, to Sefer Shmuel is not just a biography of Shaul and it's not a biography of David. Sefer Shmuel is an expose on power. And it's looking at how power, even when it's centralized, right? Sefer Shoftim ends and says, this is not the ideal. Let's try kingship. Kingship isn't the ideal either. Right? And one of the reasons we understand that kingship is not the ideal is because power, as we learned very quickly early on, corrupts even the best of people. And how do we watch power corrupt, or how do we watch the corruption of power manifest in Sefer Shmuel? By the women, by the juxtaposition of the women that are independent and resilient and resourceful, juxtaposed with the women that are objectified and victimized when power goes unchecked. Okay. We could look at this in all of the narrative portions of Tanakh. We could look at the legal codes that appear that smack our sensibilities and feel so offensive to our modern sensibilities. And by the way, this is really important. It is not apologetics to say we need to learn the ancient Near Eastern law codes to understand how Tanakh diverges in its treatment of women. If we look at Isha Sota, for example, I'll just say very, very quickly and then I'm wrapping up. If we look at Isha Sota, okay, Isha Sota seems like a crazy, shameful law. A woman is suspected of being an adulteress, so she's taken to the temple and her hair is undone and she's forced to drink this water. If we go back to the, again, sort of contemporaneous legal constructs that existed at this time, if a woman is suspected of adultery, if her husband decides she's guilty or his friends decide she's guilty, she can be killed. What God is saying in Isha Sota, God says, you know, let her drink the water. And if she's guilty, I'll have however we understand those psukim, a prolapsed uterus, however we want to understand. But what God is essentially doing in those halachot is preventing a kangaroo court where an innocent woman can be killed just because her husband is paranoid or suspects her. Okay. And again, I can do so many examples. The girl who's suspected of not being a virgin on her wedding night, and we read that the parents can send her out to be stoned. That sounds crazy to us until we remember that the onus of proving her virginity lies on the parents, not the husband. So it's actually in way of preventing the slaughter of an innocent girl. And I could go on and on, but what I'm sort of asking you to do, and then I'll finish with one quick quote. What I'm asking you to do really is not walk away when we see something in Tanakh that smacks against our sensibilities, and it should, okay? It should, because we have evolved, right? Just like we never say you poke an eye for an eye. We also have to understand the laws in the context of an evolved society. That's important, but we have to do that and we have to do the work, and learning Tanakh in depth is the only way to truly understand how we can reconcile an ancient Near Eastern cultural backdrop, a patriarchal backdrop, with transcendent truths that are eternal. And in order to do that, we need to delve in and we need to understand it fully. So I'll end with one really, really quick quote, just because I think that of all quotes, this might be one of the most emphatic, and I think it'll really lead into what Paul is about to talk about. At the end of the story, if you remember, we said Yael kills Sisera and she successfully protects, right? By killing Sisera, again, if we say rape is so often synonymous with war, right? That's what happens in the aftermath of war, is that the women on the losing side are raped by the victors. So by killing Sisera, Yael actually prevented everything that would have happened in the aftermath of war. But then at the very, very end of her song, Dvorah sings a beautiful song in Parakeh, singing about the victory and how wonderful it is that God enabled them to, and she praises Yael for her bravery. At the very, very end, there's a bizarre two psukim, okay? And I'm going to read them to you very quickly because I think this is as clear as Tanakh gets about where we should stand on women's issues and on violence against women. It says in the end that after we already know, right, there's a little dramatic irony in the song, we know Sisera has been killed. We know where he is, okay? But then at the very end of Dvorah's song, it says, "Va'ad hachalon nishkefa v'tiabev em Sisera ba'ad ha'eshnav." Sisera was sitting by the window and she was crying because she doesn't know why her son is delayed, right? Now, no person with a heart, I think, right, no matter how bad someone might be, doesn't feel a tiny bit of sympathy for a mother whose child is delayed and she doesn't know where he is during wartime, okay? But we lose our sympathy very quickly because she's sitting there saying, where is he, where is he? And then we're told that one of her wise maidens come over and she says, don't worry, says, Madua, and she says, Madua boshesh rikhbo lavo, Madua acharu, how come I don't hear his chariots? And it says, Chachmot sarotea ta'anena. One of her wise maidens comes to cheer her up, to make her feel better. And what does she say? Afi tashiv amarehala, halo yimtzu yichalku shalal, racham rachmatayim lirosh gever. She says, don't worry. And now I am paraphrasing because it's poetic. She says, don't worry. He's probably late because he's out collecting silks and dyed cloths and wombs. Meaning, cheer up. He's probably late because he's out raping women. Okay. And the Tanakh ends with the song ends with the following words: Ken yovdu kol oivecha Hashem. A society that allows for sexual violence, that promotes sexual violence, that is okay with women sitting cloistered behind a window and allowing what's happening outside to determine the fabric of that society, is a society that God does not tolerate, and by definition that we should not tolerate. And so I'm going to segue into Paula, who's going to tell us how to make sure that we don't continue to tolerate a world like that.
Shreinu Yael, that we have women Tanakh scholars in our time that can look at Tanakh in this way. And Shreinu that we live in a time where we can speak out and teach Tanakh in this way. Thank you. Paula Kweskin-Weiss is an award-winning documentary filmmaker, writer, and human rights attorney. She believes in the power of media and arts to advocate for change. She's the founder and director of the global women's rights nonprofit organization, The 49%, a group dedicated to advancing global women's rights through media and film. It has been an honor working with you towards this event, and I invite you to address us.
Good evening, and thank you so much for being here. Not an easy evening at all, but I hope that I'll be able to leave you all inspired and with some points to move forward. So before I get started, I just want to say that it's really important for me to frame this conversation and to say that we're not just talking about names. These are not just words. These are not just stories in a newspaper. These are women. These are women who are living beautiful lives. These are women who are living beautiful lives just a couple of hours from where we are today. And it is my hope that by gathering here tonight, by learning words of Torah, by hearing the powerful work of social justice advocates here in Israel, by thinking more deeply about what we can do as individuals, that we are returning some semblance of dignity to these beautiful, incredible women, to our sisters, to our family members. And yes, I am a lawyer and I deeply believe in justice, but that's not really what my aim is here tonight. I think, as Orit said, that we're not yet near justice. We're pretty far from justice. But what we can do, what all of us can do, is elevate ourselves and bring back dignity. And so that is my intention, that is my kavanah as I speak to you this evening. I'm a human rights lawyer. My focus is on women's rights law. It has been for over the past decade. And I think that even though we are so deeply troubled and have been so egregiously failed by the international system, it's still incumbent upon us to understand what the international system is. And so in my remarks tonight, I do want to share with you about the global human rights and women's rights structures that exist, that are there, that are supposed to be protecting us. I believe that certain institutions, and I will say this multiple times, but I believe that certain institutions are irreparably broken. I believe the United Nations is irreparably broken. Okay, and I think that and I'm glad I see nods around the room. I think that it's incredibly important that we stand united in that message. I think that there's other organizations such as Human Rights Watch and others that are also irreparably broken. If politics supersedes and overcomes human rights and the mandate of the institutions, then these are institutions that are failed and they are broken, and we should continue to say that over and over again. However, we can still understand an international framework that underpins these institutions, and that's what I want to speak about now. I'm going to walk through a few, and I also want to just be careful and mention that a lot of these frameworks deal with state actors. State actors are states, governments, and of course, what the brutalities that we're referring to tonight are non-state actors, a terrorist group, which, I mean, there are books and books written about this. So it's not exactly equivalent to be applying some of these ideologies against the non-state actors. However, we are dealing in a system, a universal system in which these non-state actors are acting. And so I still, again, think it's very important that we understand how they're factoring in. And in many cases, they're being treated as state actors. And so if they're going to be treated as state actors in certain instances, then they also need to have these ideologies and these expectations against them. Okay, so firstly, let's talk a little bit about international law. It's a little bit of a heady topic, but I can really break it down quickly. A lot of international law and international human rights law was born when? After the Holocaust. Okay, so much of the law that we are referring to right now was actually born in the years following the Holocaust. The word genocide, which is being thrown around right now, was a word and a phrase that was invented because there was no word, there was no legal understanding of the atrocities that could be perpetrated against a society, against a people. And so they had to invent a word. And that's where the word genocide came from. I'm going to be talking about modern international law in that sense, and I'm going to be speaking about crimes against humanity. Now, crimes against humanity also came about right after World War II. It was first described in the Nuremberg trials, but it didn't indicate at that point widespread rape. Only later on, when it was codified by the Rome Statute, which was in the 90s, was crimes against humanity was specified and included, in this case, rape, torture, and other horrifically violent acts against people. Now, I just also want to mention, because we're going to start hearing about this more and more, what is the International Criminal Court? The International Criminal Court is a body that was created in 1998 by the Rome Statute. It was, again, a conversation for another time, but the idea is that a group of actors, of states, came together and said, we have to define the worst crimes that could possibly happen against humanity, against individuals, not just crimes against humanity, also genocide, also crimes of aggression, and how can we as an international community confront this? Okay, so again, in the Rome Statute, although crimes against humanity first appeared during the Nuremberg trials, it was codified and specified in 1998 by the Rome Statute. Okay, that's one area. Next, we have the United Nations, okay? The United Nations, and what we've been hearing about a lot is UN Women. Now, UN Women is an agency underneath the United Nations. The United Nations has many different agencies, many different roles. I mean, there's the food program, for example. They happen to do pretty good work, and so on and so forth. But we're talking tonight about UN Women. And UN Women is a body that its mandate is women's empowerment, women's equality, okay? And they're guided by several international principles. I won't go into all of them, but I'll go into two of the most important. Firstly, the UN Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW, C-E-D-A-W. That's one very important international framework, okay, which many countries have signed and ratified into law, including Israel. And that speaks about discrimination against women in all sorts of forms. Certainly, we can understand that violence against women is a form of discrimination against women, so that is part and parcel of that instrument. And we also have something incredibly important, which is UN Security Council Resolution 1325. Again, there's lots of different international frameworks that go towards guiding UN women, and one of them is 1325, and that's all about women in conflict. And as my two colleagues mentioned, unfortunately, since the ancient times all the way until today, women's bodies and violence against women has been part of war. However, this UN Security Council resolution, which is considered binding international law, talks specifically about armed conflict and women in armed conflict. And it says, all parties to armed conflict must take special measures to protect women and girls from gender-based violence, particularly rape and other forms of sexual abuse, and all other forms of violence in situations of armed conflict. So there we have it spelled out in black and white, even if you're not looking at crimes against humanity from the Nuremberg and then from the Nuremberg principles and also from the ICC, the Rome Statute, we have it in 1325, okay? Now, we probably won't have too much time to talk about this, but this is important for those of us living in Israel. 1325 also demands or strongly encourages that women are part of all peacemaking initiatives, that when there is rebuilding after an armed conflict, women should be part of the conversation. And I don't know about you, but I've not seen a lot of women in these conversations. I've not seen a lot of women on the news. I've not seen a lot of women being interviewed. I don't see enough women in the IDF and certainly not in the government. So I saw an amazing sign today as I was leaving Ra'anana, and it said, Yachad Michadash. Okay, so thank God we're already starting to think about Mashu Chadash. And I am telling all of you, and I'm asking all of you to have it incumbent upon us that women are going to be building this Michadash. Okay, now, what happened following the violence? So now I've told you about the international framework that should have been there, okay? So, oh, by the way, it's there, it's just not being used, okay? So what should have happened? Well, UN Women should have said something on October 8th, okay? And they didn't. But maybe they don't do that, right? Maybe that's not something they do. No, they do, okay? In July and August of 2023, UN Women and a panel of experts repeatedly sounded the alarm on widespread rape and violence against women in Sudan. Also this past summer, UN Women condemned rape in Ethiopia in response to armed conflict. That is what they do. That is part of their mandate, and they should have done that immediately. Now, a colleague that I hope to meet one day, I hold her in very high esteem, Kochav Elkayam Levi. She's a law professor and expert on international law. I think you're going to be hearing her name quite a bit. And she is an expert in this. And I think, she probably thought maybe they don't know, right? Maybe the international bodies just don't know. So what did she do? In the days following, she started gathering as much evidence as she could. She put it all together in 3 petitions / letters, and had 160 legal experts sign these letters and petitions, which, oh, by the way, doesn't happen normally. Do you think 160 law professors got together about Sudan or Ethiopia? I'm not sure, but I highly doubt it. So she sent 3 letters, victimologists, humanitarian law, human rights experts. And what happened? Silence, okay? So let's us think for a second that they didn't know, because they knew. So what should happen now? What should happen now under international law? Well, there's lots of different ways forward. And I actually learned quite a bit from Orit in terms of the lack of evidence, and that's something that we're gonna have to grapple with. But in international law and throughout these past modern decades, we have seen the prosecution of mass rape cases, okay? In responses to the wars in Yugoslavia and Rwanda, international tribunals were established to prosecute perpetrators of war crimes. The International Criminal Tribunal of Yugoslavia, the International Criminal Law Tribunal of Rwanda. And these were really watershed moments in international law, in human rights law, I would say for the modern age, where there was really the international community came together and said there cannot be impunity for the absolute violence perpetrated, not just in terms of war crimes, but again, in terms of crimes against humanity. And for the first time in an international setting, mass rape was tried as a crime against humanity, And individuals were prosecuted and sentenced for their crimes. And you can look and see some of these individuals from Yugoslavia and Rwanda are currently serving sentences. And this is when justice works, right? This is when we have this momentum. So why am I telling you this? I don't know what's going to happen. We are still living this trauma, but I want us to know that there are possibilities. I want us to know that the international community has responded to, these issues before, that it's not unprecedented. So we have had this silence, and as a result of the silence, why I hold my colleague in such high esteem, Kochav Elkayam established a civil commission on the crimes committed by Hamas against women and children on October 7th. So in the face of the international silence, now experts in Israel are doing everything they can to gather information and details, and so there can be no questions, and we'll have, I assume, our own tribunal. This is happening right now, and I think we're going to have to still see how the details unfold. But I just want to say again, for the record, that we have been deeply, egregiously, painfully, and completely, I think, mercilessly failed by a system that was supposed to protect us. And as a result, we have a moral imperative to respond to the failure of this system. Now, something that I've thought a lot about, I mean, it's only been 3 months, but that I'm starting to think a lot about is, if you have United Nations completely fail us, right? UN Women, okay, says nothing. Does that mean that there's no such thing as women's rights? Do you understand the logic a bit? Like, if there's an entity that purports to be the torchbearers of human rights and women's rights, and then they say nothing, does that mean that we're in a post-women's rights society, in a post-human rights society? I mean, that's, I wouldn't be surprised in terms of like living in a post-modern society. I would say, of course, that's not true, but I'm bringing it up because I think it's so important. Why is it so important? Because we cannot receive our lessons about human rights and women's rights from these entities anymore. Now that they have so painfully, deeply, egregiously failed us, they do not get to be the torchbearers for this anymore. And so that means it's on us to be the torchbearers. It's on us to be the ones who are holding the book of human rights. And of course, we didn't need these entities to be the ones teaching us about human rights. Of course, because we're the Jewish people, and we've been the ones holding the book of human rights for over 3,000 years. So we know what it is to encourage a life of dignity, a life where there's equality, a life where women are considered equal and are able to thrive and live a good life and are not treated as second-class citizens. We have that all in the Torah. I think what's so upsetting, of course, is that in 2023, we didn't think that we would need to teach the world those lessons. We've been told now for decades that the world understands that we're living in a society that understands and values human rights. Well, apparently it's not true, and we still have a lot of work to do. We have to declare, as I said, that the UN and these international organizations are morally bankrupt. And I believe it's about strengthening that position moving forward. Okay, so what can we do? I promise there is what we can do. Now, these double standards are completely intolerable, and it's up to us to make sure that we change it. Now is the time for one-on-one conversations. And I challenge all of us in this room, but I very much challenge those of you who are on Zoom to have these one-on-one conversations. I do believe that these institutions have failed us, but I still deeply believe that there are individuals that stand with us. For example, another one of my heroes, Catherine McKinnon, who is a world famous feminist legal scholar who wrote many books on war crimes against women, has spoken out about this bravely and proudly. And there are other individuals who are coming to the front and speaking about this.
Can you say her name again?
Catherine McKinnon. We need to we need to build up those relationships, and we need to continue to reach out and form those relationships, all while acknowledging and expressing that institutions such as the UN are morally bankrupt. We can do that in many ways. We can challenge them at every single turn. We can express our disgust to elected officials. We can challenge the funding that these organizations get. We can complain if UN officials are on a panel. In the United States, for example, there's regional chapters of the United Nations. So that's something that each of us can do. And I very much want to acknowledge the work of Me Too Unless You're a Jew movement. They have a brilliant petition. I encourage everybody to sign it. They're doing a lot more, even as we speak, in terms of getting that petition to have real tangible results. So that's the first thing we can do, is acknowledge the double standard and talk about it all the time. This is mainly for audiences abroad. Number 2 is please engage with local women's rights organizations. I started emailing a few women's rights organizations and I said, what are you doing about decrying what happened to Israeli women on October 7th? There are women's rights institutions, there are rape crisis centers in most cities in the United States and in Canada, and why not reach out and have a conversation with them? Ask them to create the moral clarity within the community. I think that's more important than we can even imagine. Educate them on the issue and start building those bridges. Number 3, this is for an audience here. I think that we're just beginning to acknowledge the collective trauma that all of us are facing. I think an event like tonight, that's happening exactly 3 months to the date, is the beginning of that collective process. And so for those of you who are leaders in your community, I would say, how can we be creative about creating additional spaces like this, where we can process the trauma, where we can come together and acknowledge the trauma? Is there a yoga teacher? Is there, a somatic counselor that can come and work with us all? I think it's so deeply important, and I believe in terms of moving forward, we've got to start acknowledging that. And finally, I want to share some personal work that I've been doing, which has given me a lot of strength, and every single one of you is welcome to be part of it. As was mentioned in my introduction, I'm a human rights lawyer, but I've been working in media and film for the last 10 plus years. I've made many different documentary films that have been shown in many parts of the world. And I've worked with diverse women, especially Muslim women, as it turns out. My first film was a film called Honor Diaries about honor-based violence. And I had a chance to really form very strong connections with Muslim women who were speaking out about human rights abuses in their own community. So in the days following October 7th, I was delighted and shocked, to be honest, that I started getting message after message after message from Muslim women whom I've worked with over the past many years, asking how I was, checking in with me, expressing their horror. And I wish I weren't surprised. I mean, I shouldn't have been surprised, but I think in those days we all were getting such the news and the protests against us. So it was very easy to think that we were alone. We're not entirely alone. And there are some very brave women and men who are standing up for what's right. So in those days following, what happened was we started meeting every week on Zoom. Myself and a couple of other Israeli and Jewish women and Muslim women from all over the world. And at first we just cried, and then we spoke about what could possibly be next for us. And slowly, we've built something called The Collective. And The Collective is a space to imagine a world beyond this, a world of partnership where we can find so much that connects us, where we speak out against violence against women, where we declare boldly together for the return of our hostages, where we speak out against terrorism in all its forms. Many of the women that are part of The Collective have experienced terrorism themselves, or their countries have been destroyed by terrorism. So they understand very much what we're going through. So I very much encourage you all to be part of that. What we're doing now is getting their voices out to the media, and we're starting eventually in the next month or two to have dinners all throughout the United States, North America, perhaps around the world, where we'll have small, intimate groups to have these painful conversations, but that are the conversations. So Before I leave you tonight, what I want to do is hopefully uplift you a little bit and show a clip from my dear friend Soraya Dean. Soraya is also a human rights lawyer. She's a Sri Lankan woman living in California. She's incredibly brave. In fact, the footage that you're going to see, oh, that's still me, but the footage you're going to see is when Soraya and a group of Muslim women came to Israel a few weeks ago on a solidarity mission. And I was able to go and film them and get some beautiful content. So here's just 2 minutes of Soraya speaking, and I think it'll be very empowering.
So we know what happened on October 7th. The Hamas infiltrated into Israel territory. And then what they did to the women, what they did to everybody is unacceptable and despicable, but particularly what they did to the women sent a strong message to people like us who are working for women's rights, women's freedoms, and women's equality. Because once the women of a nation are shaken, it shakes the whole nation. And that's exactly what they wanted to do. They abuse the women and the mothers. And that is genocidal. And we are appalled that the United Nations has taken so long. I heard today, finally, they released a statement condemning the atrocities towards Jewish women. I say Jewish sisters because, Audre Lorde would say, we are not free when another woman is not free. We are not free when another woman is raped or abused. And particularly in this situation, our Jewish sisters were abused. They were raped. They were decapitated. Their limbs were amputated. So I stand vehemently opposed to that, and I call out the United Nations and I call out Western feminist organizations who have taken so long, I said they were constipated, who have taken so long to call out these atrocities. And we should not let it go, because my friend Phyllis Kessler wrote a beautiful article 2 days ago. And I told Phyllis, can we write out the list of feminist organizations? Because naming the wrong is critical for us not to make it happen again. And we are appalled. We are terribly appalled. We are terribly grieved that the abuse, the savagery and the brutality towards our Jewish sisters was not condemned sufficiently, was not condemned promptly, and was not condemned as it was necessary that it needed to be condemned. So we know what happened on October 7th.
I'll end there. I think it is so incredibly inspiring to see Soraya. There are other Sorayas out there, and I think it's incumbent upon us to reach out our hands and create those bridges and connections. And I just want to leave each of you empowered. We each have a voice, okay? We're each here, we're stronger together, and we can go out to the world, even after such horrors have been inflicted upon us. We can go out, we can demand justice, and we can imagine a better future, all of us together. Thank you so much.
I'm still holding Yael's watch, which on my watch, I'm going to allow a few more minutes. That's okay. So firstly, Paula, thank you.
Amazing.
Thank you for your incredible presentation, for your call to action. And tomorrow, please God, each of you will receive an email thanking you firstly for coming tonight and for supporting and in your own way, making yourselves into activists. And it will have a link on it to sign the petition of the UN hashtag Me Too unless you're a Jew organization. So we are going to open up just for maybe 3 questions. Anyone in the audience want to share a question? My mother, Granny.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not an expert in the Red Cross, but I will say that it's been deeply disappointing. I mean, I think we need to question I think we need to question their standards. I think we need to question their usefulness, but I also think that we're in a very precarious situation because we're depending on them right now. But it's clear that that many of these institutions that we hold to such high esteem are actually very politicized. But I guess my own instinct right now is for us to save that criticism for after, when, please God, everyone is home safely.
Karen, what would be your response to someone who wanted to link the response and the calling out of what's happened to Israeli women to what's happening to people in Gaza?
I just want to make sure I understand your question. What exactly is happening to people in Gaza? I think that's important to understand what you're saying.
You know what, I think that I could imagine that there would be people who would be willing to help support what's the challenges, the atrocities that we've experienced here, but then also say, but at the same time, Paula, we need to stand just as strongly against the violence and the genocide that's happening at the moment.
Okay, well, I understand. So first of all, I think that I won't say we, I'm going to speak from a very personal place. I have deep empathy for what's happening to people in Gaza. I truly do. That is my own personal experience. I don't demand that of anybody else. I think that we also need to understand, though, if we're looking at a legal context, that's where I'm coming at this conversation. And from a legal context, what happened on October 7th was completely against international law. It was illegal under international law. We had a ceasefire in place with Hamas. And so the infiltration into our territory, the brutality inflicted upon our people, I mean, I don't need to go through. It's most likely rises to the level of war crimes. I mean, I probably don't even need to say most likely. It does rise to the level of war crimes. It's so clear. Okay. Next, we have a government, an army that is working within the framework of international law, that has international legal scholars and experts at every single turn analyzing their movements and deciding before every single decision is made how it fits into international law. Unfortunately, in war, civilians are killed. That is very distressing, and yet it is a part of war. And so I find that this conflation is completely misled. It's not appropriate. The only place that it could be considered appropriate is that we can feel empathy for human life and human suffering. But if we're speaking from a legalistic perspective, these are 2 completely separate issues, and they need to be spoken about in that way. Oh, yes, right, of course. Tammy reminded me that, of course, I mean, we started receiving criticism before there was even a ground invasion. So we could see the politicization
I
already.
just want to clarify, the reason for my
I
question
know.
is to hear a really good articulation, I thought you did it brilliantly, of what can we say when we hear that challenge.
Are there any Muslim women organizations that you are collaborating?
Yes, many, in fact.
How you can-
Yeah, so the work, my organization, the 49%, right now, one of our major projects is The Collective, which is working with Muslim women from many different organizations. Many of them have their own organization. Soraya, who you saw, has her organization. So I definitely see that there are some grassroots entities that are starting to speak out. And that's why I wanted to bring that up tonight, because I think we have to empower them. They receive a lot of pushback, they receive a lot of threats, and I think that they're looking for Jewish sisters and sisters of other faiths to come together in that way. But if, please go to the 49%.org, become part of our listserv. You'll see all the things that we're doing, and most likely tomorrow we'll send you a link as well. Okay. Thank you all so much.
A big thank you to all of you for coming. We are going to let you go to sleep very soon. We just want to end the evening off with Hatikva. So please, if you can join us, we're going to end strong.